On the 5th of January 1942, exultant shouts of victory resounded in the streets of Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Combined Fleet, was celebrating in public, but worrying in private. Despite the triumphant start to the Pacific War, he instructed his staff to begin preparing for the second stage of operations. With a gnawing sense of unease, Yamamoto's study of the situation, reports on the Philippines, Malaya, and Point South indicated that Japanese troops would soon be in control of East Asia and all other areas attacked in December. The speed with which Japan had conquered the Western Pacific astounded the planners in Tokyo. The victories were glorious, yet Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, that he wanted the plans completed quickly by the middle of February. The reason for the urgency and the admiral's anxiety lay in his deep understanding of the enemy. Japan had provoked Yamamoto, who had been Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, knew the Americans well. He was less than enthusiastic about starting a war with the United States and Britain, and he worried intensely about the future. His friends on the Imperial General Staff were so concerned about his public opposition to unlimited war that they feared he might be assassinated if he remained in Tokyo. Even aboard his flagship, the Yamato, his opinions were no secret. 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto warned a friend, ultra-nationalist President Ryoichi Sasakawa, that war was inevitable due to the politicians' decisions. Yamamoto had predicted, "At first we'll have everything our own way," stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. Just 1 month into the war, the Japanese octopus was spread almost flat, conquering territory at an unbelievable pace. But Yamamoto offered a critical warning. The euphoria could not last. He believed Japan had only about a year and a half to bask in glory before America's massive industrial capacity, its war machine, would fully engage. "We must get a peace agreement by then," he told Sasakawa. This meant Japan needed a major victory quickly, followed by a swift negotiation. In early January, victory certainly seemed close. The American battleship fleet was out of action at Pearl Harbor. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk. Manila, the U.S. naval base at Cavite, and Hong Kong had all been captured. Japanese forces were preparing for new landings across the Dutch East Indies, Rabaul, Ambon, and the Solomon Islands. However, the Pearl Harbor attack had failed to destroy the most critical elements of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the aircraft carriers, which were at sea and unharmed. They represented a constant existential threat to the Japanese. What Yamamoto needed next was a spectacular, game-changing achievement to force Washington to the peace table. He had initially expected the crucial fall of Singapore to take 5 or 6 months. It fell on February 15th, ahead of schedule. Despite this unexpected speed, Yamamoto knew it was not enough to set the stage for negotiation. He needed to move in another direction entirely. The question for his planners was, where to strike next? Yamamoto's favorite plan was to attack the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet, destroy it, and then push into the Middle East to link up with the Germans. This would secure vital oil for the Japanese Navy. The Army refused to consider a Middle Eastern operation. The Australia Plan. Advocated by the Naval General Staff, it called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of a key forward base. Yamamoto disliked this plan because he thought it would take too long and still wouldn't be spectacular enough to stop the Americans' Yamamoto's own proposal. He ordered a plan drawn up to destroy the American carrier force in a decisive battle off Midway Island. He also included the AL Plan, detailing the invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. He hoped victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give the politicians a solid base for negotiating the peace he so desperately desired. Yamamoto knew that Pearl Harbor had aroused a strong spirit of vengeance in the American people the Japanese had learned to detest as soft and incompetent. He believed even the capture of Singapore would not halt the Americans. He needed a victory so crushing it would allow Japan to extend a generous olive branch and secure a lasting peace. In Tokyo, the admirals quarreled over the plans, but in the end, Yamamoto had his way. Midway was set. Yet, a critical event, entirely unexpected, was about to render the significance of both Singapore's fall and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor irrelevant to the Japanese high command. The reason that those great territorial victories were no longer considered important lay in the April 1942 raid of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The Doolittle Raid had shocked the Japanese into a realization that the Americans were only beginning to fight. Suddenly, the Japanese homeland, the sacred symbol of the empire, was vulnerable. The psychological blow was immense, far outweighing the minimal physical damage. This attack, launched from American carriers far across the Pacific, forced the Japanese to instantly prioritize the destruction of those carriers and the establishment of an outer defense ring around the home islands. This raid was the true forgotten catalyst that drove Yamamoto's Midway plan forward and ultimately committed the combined fleet to a disastrous confrontation. By June, after the Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan, there was no time for recrimination. The news of the destruction of 4 big fleet carriers was suppressed, known only at the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto was occupied at Midway, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo was already moving naval and air forces steadily southward, setting up the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australia. Naval forces had taken Rabaul in January, conducting constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands in New Guinea. The Australians, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur, knew the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea, and if successful, would likely take northern Australia. In February, the Japanese bombed Darwin. In March, they invaded Salamaua, New Guinea. In May, before the Battle of Midway, they sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby, only to be turned back by the American and Australian defense in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did manage to occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and built a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced planners in Washington and Australia that a major Japanese thrust in the South Pacific was imminent. The urgency led to a major strategic disagreement on the Allied side, primarily between General MacArthur and Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations. MacArthur's plan. After the Midway victory, MacArthur suggested a preemptive Allied attack on the New Britain, New Ireland area, and an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base. King's counterplan. Admiral King opposed placing MacArthur in command of this Pacific fighting, citing concerns about carriers being subject to land-based attack and insufficient protection. King devised his own plan, a drive from the New Hebrides, led by Navy Command. The Joint Chiefs of Staff eventually sided with King, acknowledging that his plan would require relatively less force and built upon his existing defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia. Phase 1 of the plan was given to Admiral King, the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions. Guadalcanal was simply a spot on the map, with no known tactical or strategic value. It didn't even merit a name in the initial JCS plan. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, set out a 4-stage plan: hold the line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces, a combined offensive through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago, seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, an eventual move to the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. Admiral King approved this vision. Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley was brought in to head the South Pacific Command. Admiral Turner was put in command of the amphibious operation. As Gormley arrived at Pearl Harbor on June 19th, he received alarming news. On May 22nd, an Army plane saw Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal, suggesting the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield. By June 25th, Army intelligence reported burnt grass and tents on the island's central plain, with a wharf under construction at Lunga. A few days later, an Australian coastwatcher on Guadalcanal reported that airfield construction was only awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. This was confirmed by American radio intelligence, which picked up a message that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, Japanese construction units, would arrive on July 4th. Admiral Turner realized where the American invasion was going. The Solomons, specifically Guadalcanal. Gormley, however, was full of gloomy thoughts. He left Washington convinced the U.S. was not ready for aggressive action, struggling to get proper tools and supplies. The The supplies of the invasion forces, for example, were loaded hodgepodge aboard the transports and sent to a location, Noumea, without proper unloading facilities. The deadline remained fixed, and by late July, 17,000 Marines were on the move. 1553. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was noted for its failures of intelligence. Allied intelligence reports reaching King on July 10th contained only a casual comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal. A few days later, a report located the field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield. Back at Combined Fleet Headquarters, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders for the first stage mission to leave Rabaul on August 14th. On July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the tactical commander, called a tense meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. The meeting was not a happy one. The main source of tension was Fletcher's controversial decision. He announced he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days, insisting that the carriers must not be risked. This decision, driven by his fear of losing his carriers, was a huge blow to the morale and strategic planning of the landing forces. Admiral Turner chided his superior, reminding him that the decision to risk all had been made, and it was their job to carry out orders. Fletcher's anxiety was so great that on the evening of August 6th, as the task force neared the Solomons, he nervously broke away with his carriers, positioning them as far from harm's way as possible. He would withdraw before he even received a reply from Admiral Gormley. The element of surprise, however, was complete. If American intelligence was faulty, Japanese intelligence was faultier. The Japanese had no inkling of a forthcoming attack, believing the Allies could not launch a seaborne invasion after 8 months of continuous Japanese victories. At 6 a.m., American carriers launched their first strike on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The surprise was complete. At 9 a.m., the Marines landed on Guadalcanal. They met no resistance because the Japanese, mostly construction troops, had fled into the hills. The Marines were so surprised by the ease of the landing that they found untouched wooden barracks and a breakfast table with hastily dropped chopsticks and half-filled rice bowls. One Marine famously said, "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight. All they do is run into the jungle." Across the channel on Tulagi, the fighting was a stark contrast. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's tough Marine Raider Battalion encountered stout resistance from about 250 experienced and dedicated Japanese fighters. This was the first contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war began. The Japanese defense was fierce, utilizing dugouts and machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese tactic was to hold a position until the last man. On the first night, the Japanese staged a desperate counterattack, breaking through the Marine perimeter, a preview of the death-desperate counterattacks for which they would become infamous. The Marines were shocked by the Japanese spirit. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who, with only one loaded pistol, shot each other rather than surrender. The American troops found it difficult to understand how cornered or wounded men would almost invariably choose death to surrender. After a few Japanese soldiers pretended to surrender only to attack their captors, the Marines learned to take them on their own terms. The small Japanese garrisons on Tulagi, 250 men, and Gavutu, Tanambogo, 500 men, were virtually wiped out to the last man. By the morning of August 8th, the Marines on Guadalcanal reached the edge of the airfield, which they would name Henderson Field. The easy advance on Guadalcanal stood in sharp contrast to the sheer savagery of the fighting on Tulagi. The Japanese reacted immediately to the flash of invasion from Tulagi to Rabaul. On the first day, 27 twin-engine Betty bombers and 180 fighters were dispatched from Rabaul to strike the American invasion force. The American carrier fighters and the ship's guns were ready. The Japanese were feeling the results of counterattack for the first time in the South Pacific. Of the 24 bombers that arrived over Guadalcanal, all but one were shot down. However, the renowned Japanese Zero fighter proved its superiority over the American F-4F Wildcat. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai shot down several American planes, though his own Zero was badly smashed in the process. The Japanese Zero had the edge in climb, maneuverability, and speed, but the F-4F Wildcat was sturdier and had better armor protection. The Americans quickly learned the trick: stick close, use the F-4F's superior firepower, and exploit the Zero's limited ability to withstand punishment. By nightfall on the first day, the U.S. invasion seemed secure, with 11,000 Marines ashore and vast piles of supplies crowding the beaches. The next morning, August 8th, more Japanese bombers struck. A blazing bomber dived into the transport George F. Elliott, setting it on fire. A dive bomber torpedoed the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That day, the American carrier pilots counted their losses. 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The cost of protection. The cost of meeting the Zeros was 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. This loss convinced Fletcher that his decision to withdraw was sound. As Fletcher withdrew his air cover at 6 p.m., the Japanese 8th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa, was already moving in force. Mikawa had with him 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. Mikawa's battle plan was audacious: cut speed to arrive after midnight on August 8th and make a surprise night attack on the American forces. He knew the Americans had no record of competence in night naval operations, whereas it was a Japanese specialty. American intelligence failed him again. On August 8th, the most obvious approach for an enemy force, the slot, the waterway between the Solomon Islands, was left completely uncovered in the search plan. The American commanders at Guadalcanal were unknowingly exposed. Mikawa's force, having slipped through the slot undetected, was poised to strike the unprotected U.S. Navy's support fleet and its 17,000 Marines in the early hours of August 9th. The battle for Guadalcanal, which would rage for 6 grueling months, was a direct consequence of the shock delivered by the Doolittle Raid. Yamamoto's realization that the Americans were only beginning to fight forced the Japanese into a strategic overreach at Midway, and an unprepared, fragmented defense at Guadalcanal marked the transition of the war. It was no longer a Japanese conquest, but a brutal, attritional battle for survival. The easy victories were over, replaced by the savagery of island warfare, and the overwhelming power of the American industrial engine Yamamoto had always feared. The illusion of Japanese victory, shattered by a few B-5 bombers over Tokyo, had fully collapsed on a small, insignificant island in the Solomons. The fight for Guadalcanal would test the limits of courage, leadership, and logistics for both sides. To understand the bloody naval aftermath of Mikawa's night attack and how the U.S. Navy struggled to keep the Marines supplied, please click the next video on your screen now.